What if ancient civilizations sensed their own destruction long before it arrived? Across deserts, jungles, and drowned coastlines, vanished empires left warnings in rituals, art, and final inscriptions, signals historians dismiss as coincidence. Yet letters, carvings, and astrological records reveal a pattern of foreknowledge, societies trembling on the edge, aware but powerless. Tonight we uncover 25 lost civilizations that predicted their own collapse. Not myth, not folklore, a pattern. Once seen, it can't be unseen. Welcome, seekers of the forbidden. If history's shadows call to you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney. Let's descend together. Morning mist rolls across limestone pillars that shouldn't exist. Not here, not this old. The stone monoliths rise from the Turkish highlands, carved with predators frozen mid-hunt, serpents coiling with geometric precision, vultures circling in formations that mirror actual flight patterns. Each pillar weighs between 10 and 20 tons. Each required quarrying, transport, and erection using only stone tools and human muscle. Each is positioned with mathematical precision that modern archaeologists needed laser surveying equipment to fully appreciate. This is 9600 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. Agriculture hasn't been invented yet. Cities don't exist. Writing won't emerge for another 5,000 years. And yet, the official story calls Göbekli Tepe the world's first temple complex, a ceremonial site where hunter-gatherers periodically assembled to worship unknown gods. But look closer at those carvings. The alignments aren't random. Pillar 43, nicknamed the Vulture Stone, shows what appear to be constellations. The arrangement of animals matches star patterns visible in the northern hemisphere around 10,000 BCE. These aren't decorative images scratched by bored shamans. They're astronomical observations rendered in stone. Recent research by Dr. Martin Sweatman at the University of Edinburgh concluded that Göbekli Tepe functioned as an early warning system, a stone calendar tracking cosmic shifts that could spell ecological disaster. The site's main enclosures align with solar and stellar events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of particular stars at critical times of year. It's more than just a calendar, it's a prediction engine. Around 10,000 BCE, the climate was changing fundamentally. The Younger Dryas cold period had just ended, a 1,000-year snapback to Ice Age conditions that had devastated populations. Now, as temperatures rose, different challenges emerged. Temperature swings brought unpredictable growing seasons. Droughts could last years. The megafauna that had sustained human hunting cultures for millennia, mammoths, giant elk, cave bears, were disappearing within a few generations. The people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't just observing these changes, they were predicting them. The carvings encode knowledge accumulated over generations, which star patterns corresponded with drought years, which lunar cycles preceded rains, which celestial configurations warned of harsh winters ahead. The construction required coordinated labor from dozens, perhaps hundreds of people. This meant surplus food, social organization, division of labor, all supposedly impossible for simple hunter-gatherers. But the pillars exist. Someone organized the labor, someone fed the workers, someone directed the astronomical observations, and someone knew famine loomed on the horizon. The animal carvings aren't random decoration, they're documentation. The predators represent dangerous, competition for declining resources. The vultures circling overhead mark the actual vultures becoming more common as megafauna carcasses littered the landscape. The scorpions, rendered in precise detail, mark the spreading of arid conditions, of desert species moving into previously temperate zones. They knew their way of life was ending. The astronomical observations told them the climate was shifting into patterns that wouldn't support the megafauna. They built Göbekli Tepe as a message. We saw it coming. They carved their predictions into stone because stone outlasts human memory. They positioned the pillars to track celestial events because the sky was the most reliable calendar available. They documented the animals and climate indicators because they understood that knowledge would be needed by whoever came after. And they were right. About everything. Within a few centuries, the region underwent exactly the transformations the site seems to predict. The megafauna disappeared. The climate stabilized into warmer, drier conditions. Hunter-gatherer societies could no longer sustain themselves. The solution was the agricultural revolution. Domestication of plants and animals. Permanent settlements. The entire restructuring of human society. Göbekli Tepe sits in what would become the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of agriculture. Not coincidentally, the people who built the site made the transition. They became farmers because hunting had become unviable, exactly as predicted. But here's the haunting detail. The site was deliberately buried, not destroyed by invaders, not abandoned in panic, buried intentionally, systematically. All the stone circles were carefully filled with rubble and soil. This took enormous effort, possibly as much effort as building the site in the first place. Perhaps the predictions had come true, and the hunter-gatherer culture had transformed so completely that the site no longer held meaning. Perhaps the new agricultural societies wanted to erase evidence of the previous order, or perhaps they buried it as a time capsule, a warning to future generations that civilizations can see their own end coming and still be powerless to stop the transformation. When Klaus Schmidt began excavating Göbekli Tepe in 1995, he uncovered our pattern's first expression, a society that foresaw its own ecological vulnerability, that predicted the end of its way of life through astronomical observation, that carved that knowledge into stone, and that watched those predictions prove accurate while being fundamentally unable to prevent the collapse they'd foreseen. Göbekli Tepe stands as the first civilization in this pattern, the first people to predict their own obsolescence and memorialize that prediction in permanent form, knowing it wouldn't save them, but hoping it might warn someone someday that knowledge and survival aren't always the same thing. And this pattern would reappear time and again, proving the same terrible truth. Seeing the end coming doesn't mean you can stop it. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro run straight and silent, brick-lined arteries through a city that once hummed with commerce, religion, and the steady flow of water through the world's most sophisticated ancient plumbing system. Walk those streets now, and your feet crunch through ash layers, through evidence of sudden abandonment, through the archaeological signatures of terror disguised as orderliness. This is 2500 BCE. Egypt is building pyramids. Mesopotamia is writing in cuneiform. And here, in the Indus Valley, sits a civilization that makes them all look primitive. Mohenjo-Daro, which means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, represents urban planning that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. The streets run in perfect grid patterns. Every house has indoor plumbing. Wastewater flows through covered drains beneath the streets. The Great Bath features waterproofing techniques that work flawlessly to this day. The official story suggests mysterious decline, perhaps invasion, perhaps catastrophic flooding, perhaps disease. The narrative is deliberately vague because the truth makes historians uncomfortable. Mohenjo-Daro knew the water was coming, and they planned their departure with the same precision they used to build the city. The city planning itself tells the story. Mohenjo-Daro was built with flood awareness woven into every decision. The entire city sits on an artificial platform above the surrounding floodplain. The Great Bath, the elevated granaries, the drainage systems, all designed by people who understood water intimately, who had calculated the risks down to the cubit. But something changed in the final phase of the city's life. Archaeological surveys show construction patterns shifting dramatically in the city's last decades. New buildings appeared on higher ground. The granaries were reinforced and expanded. The drainage systems were upgraded with additional capacity. Most tellingly, certain lower districts were quietly evacuated, not destroyed, not looted, just emptied. Houses in these districts stand largely intact. The pottery remains on shelves. Children's toys lie where they were dropped. But the people are gone, and they left in an orderly fashion, taking portable valuables but leaving heavy furnishings behind. This wasn't panicked exodus. This was planned relocation. Recent sediment analysis reveals what the residents already knew. The river was rising, not flooding seasonally as it always had, but rising permanently. The water table was climbing. Monsoon patterns were intensifying. The carefully calibrated relationship between city and water source was breaking down. The evidence is in the archaeological layers. The lowest levels show efficient drainage systems easily handling normal water flow. Middle levels show minor modifications. Channels slightly widened, overflow systems added. Upper levels show increasingly desperate hydraulic engineering. Drainage channels massively expanded, emergency overflow. Routes carved through neighborhoods, water pumping systems requiring constant manual operation. They were fighting a losing battle against hydrology, and the engineers knew it. Indus script remains undeciphered. We can't read their administrative tablets or letters. But we can read their architecture, and architecture doesn't lie. The building patterns speak clearly. Water infiltration was increasing, and the city's response was shifting from management to triage. The elevated granaries are particularly revealing. The granaries weren't just storage, they were lifeboats, keeping crucial supplies above water, even as lower areas flooded. Their expansion suggests planners anticipating sustained inundation. The Indus civilization, unlike Mesopotamia and Egypt, seems to have been relatively egalitarian. There are no massive royal palaces, no obvious temples, no monuments to individual rulers. Their response to the water crisis appears to have been organized, systematic, and focused on preserving as many people as possible rather than protecting elite privilege. Some families left behind possessions that tell intimate stories, copper mirrors still hanging on walls, stone seals carefully arranged in dishes, toy carts abandoned where children had been playing. These aren't the traces of people fleeing in terror. These are the traces of people who packed what they could carry and left believing they might return. They never returned. But here's what's crucial. They had time to leave because they'd seen it coming. The water table measurements that engineers had been recording for generations showed the trend. The seasonal flood marks on city walls tracked decades of increasing water levels. The mathematics were clear. Mohenjo-Daro was going to flood incrementally, inexorably, until the city became unlivable. So, they planned an exodus, the orderly evacuation of lower districts, the concentration of remaining population in elevated areas, the stockpiling of food, the eventual abandonment of the city entirely, with families moving to higher ground or relocating to other Indus settlements. The ash layers that archaeologists found initially suggested violent destruction, but detailed analysis revealed something different. The ash is from cooking fires that accumulated in abandoned structures over years of intermittent occupation. The city wasn't burned by conquerors. It was slowly, methodically emptied by residents who understood their engineering. Marvel could no longer protect them from the river that had sustained them. The Indus civilization continued for centuries after Mohenjo-Daro's abandonment. Other cities thrived, trade networks adjusted, but Mohenjo-Daro itself couldn't be saved, despite all its engineering genius, despite all the knowledge its planners possessed, despite all the early warnings that gave them time to prepare. Knowledge enabled an orderly withdrawal. Knowledge minimized casualties. Knowledge allowed cultural continuity. But knowledge couldn't stop the water. Dust storms roll across the plains of Ur, thick enough to blot out the sun. In the Temple of the Moon, god Nana, bells echo through empty courtyards where priests once chanted the hours. The Akkadian Empire, which stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, is collapsing in slow motion, and its rulers know exactly why. The official narrative blames climate change, as if that's something that simply happened to them, a natural disaster beyond human control or prediction. But the clay tablets tell a more damning story. Cuneiform records from the empire's final decades describe years of failed harvests. Letters between provincial governors and the central authority in Akkad grow increasingly desperate. One tablet, now housed in the British Museum, records a plea from a regional administrator. The fields are white with salt. The grain rots in the storehouses. The people cry for bread, but the granaries echo empty. They knew. The agricultural practices that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for centuries, intensive irrigation, monocropping of wheat and barley, were poisoning the soil. Salt was accumulating in the fields with each growing season. The irrigation channels that had seemed like humanity's triumph over nature were becoming vectors of destruction. Sediment cores from ancient canal systems show the salt content rising steadily over 50 years. This wasn't sudden. It was predictable, measurable, and ultimately ignored by those with the power to change course. The mechanism was straightforward, almost embarrassingly simple. Mesopotamia's rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, carried dissolved minerals, including salt from their highland sources. When farmers diverted this water into irrigation channels and spread it across their fields, the crops absorbed the water but left the salt behind. Each irrigation cycle deposited another thin layer of mineral residue. Season after season, year after year, the concentration built. At first, the changes were subtle. Yields dropped by a few percentage points. Certain crop varieties struggled while others thrived. Farmers noticed the white crust forming on soil surfaces after the water evaporated, but they had quotas to meet and mouths to feed. The empire demanded tribute, and the tribute had to be paid. Administrative records reveal that agricultural advisors repeatedly warned the palace about declining soil quality. One clay tablet from approximately 2250 BCE contains detailed observations about crop failures in specific districts, complete with recommendations for fallowing fields and rotating crops. Another document proposes reducing the tribute burden on affected provinces to allow land recovery. These recommendations were filed away and forgotten. In the palace at Akkad, kings hosted sumptuous feasts while the provinces starved. Courtiers in silk robes debated theology and law, while farmers abandoned salted fields by the thousands. The warning signs were everywhere, in the whitened soil, in the reduced crop yields, in the migration patterns of desperate families. But pride prevented action. The empire's bureaucracy was both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The same elaborate system that allowed Akkadian rulers to govern vast territories made it nearly impossible to change course once policies were established. Tax collectors needed their quotas. Military commanders needed supplies for their garrisons. Temple administrators needed offerings for the gods. The machinery of empire ground forward, consuming resources without regard for whether those resources would exist next season. One letter from a court official captures the mentality. The king cannot be seen to panic. The empire cannot admit weakness. We will endure as we always have. But endurance requires adaptability, and the Akkadian leadership confused rigidity with strength. As salt levels climbed and crop yields fell, farmers tried desperate measures. They increased irrigation, hoping more water would flush out the contamination. This only accelerated the problem, bringing even more salt into the fields. They switched to more salt-tolerant crops, but these produced less grain and couldn't sustain the empire's population. They abandoned the most damaged fields and cleared new land, but this only spread the problem to previously healthy areas. The exodus began gradually. A family here, a village there, leaving behind land their ancestors had cultivated for generations. The clay tablets record the movements. 23 households departed for the northern hills. The district of Umma reports half its fields lie empty. Refugees crowd the gates of Nippur, seeking food and work. The empire's response was predictable. They increased taxes on the remaining farmers to compensate for lost production. They restricted movement, trying to prevent the migration of workers. They blamed local administrators for mismanagement and executed several provincial governors as scapegoats. None of these measures addressed the underlying crisis. Archaeological evidence shows that by 2200 BCE, wheat cultivation had declined by nearly 40% in the Akkadian heartland. Barley, which tolerates salt slightly better, became the dominant crop. But even barley eventually succumbed as mineral concentrations reached toxic levels. They didn't endure. The Akkadian Empire predicted its own famine through decades of environmental warnings, recorded in their own administrative documents, measured in their own surveys. But hubris kept them locked in patterns that ensured collapse. The bureaucratic machinery that had built an empire couldn't change direction fast enough to save it. When the end came, it came quickly. Mass starvation, rebellion, invasion by neighboring peoples who saw opportunity in weakness. The great cities were abandoned, the irrigation systems fell into disrepair, and the desert reclaimed what had briefly been made to bloom. And another maritime civilization would soon learn the same lesson, written in volcanic ash and crashing waves. The palace at Knossos smells of ritual, incense smoke curling up from bronze braziers, the sharp tang of bull's blood from the ceremonial arena, beeswax from the lamps that light frescoed walls. The Minoans have built something remarkable here, a civilization of artists, traders, and sailors who command the eastern Mediterranean through commerce rather than conquest. But the frescoes tell secrets the official histories gloss over. Look at the bull-leaping scenes, the marine motifs, the octopi and dolphins rendered in brilliant blues and reds. Beautiful, yes. But look closer at the later frescoes, the ones painted in the palace's final phase. The compositions change, waves rise higher, the bulls grow more aggressive. And in one remarkable fresco from a villa at Akrotiri on nearby Santorini, ships flee across stormy waters while what appears to be an eruption column rises in the background. The official story says the Minoan civilization fell to the Thera eruption around 1600 BCE, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. The tsunami that followed devastated coastal settlements. Ash choked the fields. Trade networks collapsed. The narrative treats this as an unpredictable natural disaster. But the Minoans were a maritime people. They lived on islands in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. They knew volcanism. They had lived through smaller eruptions, felt the tremors that preceded them, watched the patterns of earthquakes that signaled building pressure beneath the seafloor. Archaeological evidence from Akrotiri shows the city was evacuated before the catastrophic eruption. The residents left in organized fashion, taking valuables and portable goods, but leaving behind heavier items like furniture and pottery. This wasn't panic flight. They knew what was coming. The geological record reveals that Thera didn't simply explode without warning. Seismic activity would have intensified for months, perhaps years, before the final cataclysm. Minor earthquakes would have rattled the palace walls at Knossos with increasing frequency. Springs would have changed their flow patterns, some running dry while others surged with unusual mineral content. The sea itself would have behaved strangely, withdrawing from shorelines or warming in localized areas where volcanic heat reached the ocean floor. Priests in ceremonial robes, their faces painted in ritual patterns, would have consulted the omens, the increased seismic activity, the changes in local water springs, the behavior of animals, the same environmental cues that modern volcanologists use to predict eruptions. The Minoans had something else too, an extensive maritime trade network that spanned from Egypt to the Greek mainland. Ships constantly moved between islands, carrying not just goods but information. When fishermen noticed unusual sea conditions near Thera, when shepherds on Santorini reported ground tremors, when temple attendants observed unsettling changes in sacred springs, this intelligence would have traveled quickly through commercial channels. Yet the palaces continued their rituals. The bull games went on. The great jars of olive oil and wine were sealed and stored. The trading expeditions departed on schedule. Life proceeded with the momentum of tradition, even as the warnings accumulated. They encoded these warnings in their art, dramatizing their own destruction in frescoes that showed waves and fire, that depicted maritime evacuations and desperate voyages. The famous ship fresco from Akrotiri may not be simply decorative. Some scholars now interpret it as a visual record of evacuation routes, showing the pathways people would need to take when the volcano finally erupted. But artistic prophecy couldn't stop geological inevitability. When Thera exploded, it did so with a force estimated at 4 times the Krakatoa eruption of 1883. The volcanic column reached the stratosphere. Pyroclastic flows raced across the collapsing island at hundreds of miles per hour. And then came the tsunami, waves perhaps 40 meters high, that crashed into coastal settlements across the Aegean within minutes. The evacuation of Akrotiri saved those residents who heeded the warnings. But the broader Minoan civilization, centered on Crete, faced a more complex catastrophe. The tsunami destroyed their navy and coastal infrastructure. Ash fall contaminated fields and water supplies. Most devastating, perhaps, was the psychological impact. The collapse of a worldview built on maritime supremacy and the favor of their gods. Some palaces were rebuilt, but never to their former glory. The artistic tradition continued, but the themes grew darker. Trade networks fractured and never fully recovered. Within a generation, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland were moving into Cretan palaces, filling the power vacuum left by disaster. The Minoans carved warnings in plaster and pigment, expecting their civilization to heed them. They were only partially right. Some escaped, but the culture itself drowned beneath the waves, its warnings preserved in frescoes that modern archaeologists would excavate thousands of years later, finding in ancient art. the evidence of a people who saw their doom approaching and couldn't change course fast enough to survive it. Morning fog drifts between colossal stone heads that weigh 15 tons each. Faces stare out from the jungle, African in feature, enigmatic in expression, monuments to rulers whose names died with their civilization. The Olmec heartland in what is now southern Mexico pulses with ritual, bloodletting ceremonies in torch-lit plazas, shamans chanting astronomical calculations, the steady rhythm of agricultural cycles that have sustained these cities for centuries. But those cycles are changing, and the shamans know it. The official narrative calls the Olmec decline simple agrarian collapse. The mysterious first civilization of Mesoamerica just faded, abandoned their cities, dispersed into the jungle. No drama, no specific cause, just the inevitable entropy of pre-Columbian societies. Except, the artifacts tell a different story. Jade inscriptions recovered from Olmec ceremonial centers encode astronomical information far more sophisticated than they're usually given credit for. These aren't just calendars tracking seasons for farming. They're long-count calculations predicting Venus cycles, solar alignments, and, crucially, drought patterns. The Olmecs had figured out what modern climatologists confirmed through sediment cores and tree ring analysis. The Gulf Coast region experiences cyclical droughts roughly every 150-200 years, and in the decades before 1200 BCE, those cycles were converging, multiple drought patterns aligning. The shamans could see it in their astronomical observations, in the way Venus transits coincided with reduced rainfall, in how the agricultural yields diminished with mathematical precision. They understood something profound about their world that wouldn't be rediscovered until satellite climate monitoring. Weather operates in overlapping cycles, and when those cycles synchronize, catastrophe follows. The annual variations they could manage, the decadal patterns they could plan for with stored reserves. But when century-scale oscillations aligned, when multiple drought cycles peaked simultaneously, no amount of stored maize or ritual preparation could sustain their population centers. The archaeological record shows these weren't passive observers waiting for doom. Olmec engineers modified their cities in the final decades, constructing elaborate water management systems, channels, reservoirs, aqueducts, designed to capture every possible drop during the rainy seasons and preserve it through increasingly long dry periods. The engineering was impressive, but ultimately insufficient against the scale of what was coming. Ceremonial blood rites escalated in the final decades, not because the Olmecs were becoming more savage, but because they were becoming more desperate. The blood was offerings to gods who controlled rain, fertility, the continuation of cosmic order. Each ceremony was a negotiation with fate, an attempt to forestall the inevitable through ritual precision. Picture the scene: shamans marking stars at dawn, their robes soaked with dew, obsidian blades gleaming in the first light. They're tracking Venus as it crosses the horizon, calculating the mathematics of doom, knowing that in 3 seasons, maybe 5, the rains will fail catastrophically. They carve these predictions into jade, into basalt, into the stone heads that will outlive their civilization by 3,000 years. But knowledge and action occupied different realms. The shamans could predict the drought, but they couldn't convince the population to abandon centuries of tradition, couldn't persuade people to leave their homes and ancestral lands before the crisis materialized. Human psychology resists preventive migration. People wait until conditions become unbearable, until children are starving, until there's no choice left. The rulers face their own constraints. Their legitimacy derived from their ability to maintain cosmic order through ritual and governance. To publicly acknowledge that astronomical calculations predicted civilizational collapse would undermine the very authority they needed to manage any response. So, they continued the ceremonies, intensified the rituals, carved increasingly elaborate monuments, all while quietly preparing for the worst. They created warnings in stone, expecting their society to ignore them, and their society delivered precisely that. When the drought cycles finally converged around 1200 BCE, the collapse was gradual but inexorable. Crops failed, reservoirs ran dry, the population centers that had thrived for centuries couldn't sustain themselves. People dispersed into smaller communities better suited to subsistence during climate stress. The great ceremonial centers were abandoned, their stone heads left to stare through the jungle mist at a future that would forget their warnings. The Olmecs foresaw famine through celestial mechanics, but ritual couldn't reverse climate, and knowledge couldn't fill empty granaries. Their astronomical sophistication gave them the curse of knowing what was coming, without the power to prevent it. Perhaps the most human tragedy of all, repeated across millennia by civilization after civilization, that mistook prediction for control. The jungle swallowed their cities, but their stone faces remained silent witnesses to the gap between knowing and doing. Bronze weapons glint under torchlight in palace halls, where scribes scratch cuneiform into clay tablets with methodical precision. The Hittite Empire, stretching from Anatolia deep into Syria, represents one of the late Bronze Age's great powers. Their armies crushed Egyptian forces at Kadesh in what would become one of history's most famous battles. Their diplomatic marriages stabilized entire regions, weaving webs of alliance across the ancient Near East. Their ironworking technology gave them military advantages their neighbors couldn't match, a metallurgical edge that should have guaranteed their dominance for generations. But in the palace archives at Hattusa, beneath the grand ceremonial chambers where kings received tribute and foreign ambassadors, a different story is being written, one of prolonged drought, failed harvests, and internal strife that no amount of bronze or iron can solve. The official story, the one that would echo through centuries of historical scholarship, blames the Bronze Age collapse on invasions. The mysterious sea peoples sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean like a tidal wave, destroying everything in their path with unprecedented violence. It's convenient. External enemies make for good historical narratives. They provide clear villains, decisive moments, satisfying explanations for catastrophe. But the Hittite tablets themselves, thousands of them recovered from the burned ruins of the capital at Hattusa, tell us the invasion came after the real collapse had already begun. The texts describe years of desperate grain shipments from Egypt, urgent requests for food aid that grew more frantic with each passing season. Provincial revolt sparked not by ideology, but by hunger. One letter from the Hittite king to his Egyptian counterpart reads with stark desperation, "Send grain immediately. The harvest has failed again. The northern provinces revolt. Send grain or send nothing." The "or send nothing" carries the weight of a civilization recognizing its own mortality. Famine petitions accumulated in the archives like autopsy reports, each one documenting another symptom of systemic failure. Governors described fields lying fallow, irrigation systems broken and unmaintained, farmers abandoning the land for uncertain futures elsewhere. The drought was measurable, documented in meticulous detail, even predicted by those court officials who understood agricultural cycles and water management systems. Court advisors warned the king repeatedly, their clay tablets preserved like ancient memoranda, gathering dust in bureaucratic filing systems. But the warnings were lost in palace intrigues, buried beneath the more pressing concerns of maintaining military readiness and crushing the rebellions that sprouted like weeds in the empire's increasingly fragile provinces. Resources that might have reinforced irrigation infrastructure went instead to fortifications. Grain that might have fed struggling farmers fed soldiers, marching to suppress uprisings caused by the lack of grain. The spiral was self-reinforcing, each attempted solution amplifying the underlying crisis. One courtier in silk robes, his identity lost to time, but his words preserved in fired clay, writing to a colleague in another provincial capital, noted with bitter irony, "We debate protocol while the granaries empty. We commission bronze statues while the people starve. History will not judge us kindly." He was right on that last point, though likely not in the way he imagined. The archives reveal something more disturbing than simple negligence. The Hittite bureaucracy was not ignorant of the crisis. They documented it with obsessive thoroughness. Scribes recorded rainfall levels, harvest yields, grain storage capacities, population movements. They maintained detailed inventories of resources and careful assessments of regional stability. The empire possessed the information it needed to respond effectively. What it lacked was the political will or institutional capacity to act on that information before the point of no return. Some tablets suggest factional disputes over resource allocation, different court factions advocating for different responses while precious time evaporated. Others hint at a kind of normalcy bias, a collective inability to accept that the systems that had sustained the empire for centuries were fundamentally breaking down. Still others reveal what might be called decision paralysis, an overwhelming awareness of the problem combined with conflicting recommendations that prevented any coherent response. The Hittite Empire predicted its own societal collapse through documentation so thorough we can track the disaster season by season, year by year, watching the slow-motion catastrophe unfold in ancient cuneiform. Yet, hubris, or perhaps paralysis, or perhaps the simple human inability to imagine the end of one's own world, prevented meaningful action until it was far too late. By the time the Sea Peoples arrived, they weren't conquering a mighty empire. They were delivering the final blow to a civilization already on its knees. The palace at Hattusa burned, the archives survived in the fire, their clay tablets baked harder, preserving for millennia the detailed record of a collapse that everyone saw coming and no one could stop. Another empire would follow the same tragic pattern, though their archives would speak a different language, and their collapse would unfold on a different continent. But the fundamental story, the documented disaster, the ignored warnings, the fatal paralysis, would remain remarkably disturbingly familiar. Bronze palaces echo with footsteps across polished floors, the sound reverberating through corridors decorated with breathtaking frescoes. Torchlight flickers over walls painted with hunting scenes, naval victories, processions of tribute bearers, visual proclamations of the wealth and power of Mycenaean Greece at its height. In the great halls, nobles feast on imported delicacies that demonstrate the reach of their trading networks: Syrian wine in painted amphorae, Egyptian grain ground to the finest flour, Cypriot copper crafted into elaborate vessels that gleam like captured sunlight. The world that would inspire Homer's epic centuries later is still intact, still brilliant, still seemingly invincible. The linear B tablets found in palace storerooms speak of sophisticated bureaucracy, detailed inventories, complex economic relationships spanning the Mediterranean. This is a civilization at the peak of Bronze Age achievement, its palace centers controlling vast territories through administrative networks of remarkable sophistication. But in those same administrative quarters, in rooms far from the feasting halls, scribes write on linear B tablets with what we might imagine as trembling hands, documenting a reality the nobles refuse to acknowledge. The official narrative, constructed by later scholars grappling with fragmentary evidence, suggests the Mycenaean collapse came from Dorian invasion or natural disaster, something external, unpredictable, beyond anyone's control. Earthquakes, perhaps, or waves of barbarian warriors sweeping down from the north. It's the kind of explanation that preserves dignity in defeat, that allows for tragedy without responsibility. The linear B tablets themselves suggest otherwise. These clay records, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces in a final catastrophe, survive to tell us what the final years actually looked like. They describe famine warnings ignored by palace authorities, relief efforts delayed by bureaucratic inertia and political calculation, resources diverted to military displays, and monumental construction rather than food security. One tablet from Pylos records an emergency mobilization of rowing crews, not to fight invaders or conduct raids, but to fetch grain from distant ports because local supplies had catastrophically run out. The desperation is palpable even across millennia. The palace that should have been provisioning its population was reduced to emergency measures, scrambling to import basic foodstuffs. Another tablet, fragmentary but readable, lists reduced rations for textile workers, builders, bronzesmiths, even palace guards. The economic system was collapsing from within, the elaborate redistributive networks that sustained Mycenaean civilization breaking down sector by sector, while the ruling class maintained the outward appearance of prosperity. The feast continued even as the ration lists shrank. Archaeological evidence supports and amplifies what the tablets tell us. Skeletal remains from late Mycenaean burials show increased signs of malnutrition, bones that reveal dietary deficiencies during the crucial growing years of childhood and adolescence. Dental analysis reveals dietary stress, the physical markers of hunger preserved in enamel. Population declined dramatically in rural areas as farmers fled to the palace centers, seeking relief that never came, creating refugee crises that strained urban resources past breaking point. The rural collapse is particularly telling. The Mycenaean economic system depended on agricultural surplus from the countryside supporting the palace centers. When that system broke, whether from drought, soil depletion, or the social disruption caused by inequality, the entire civilization began to unravel. Empty villages dot the archaeological record, settlements abandoned not in sudden catastrophe, but in gradual exodus, families making the calculated decision that survival lay elsewhere. The pattern is familiar by now, almost predictable. Nobles clinking wine goblets in torchlit halls, discussing poetry and politics and matters of honor while the streets outside starved. Administrators documenting the crisis in meticulous detail, their linear B tablets filled with warnings and emergency measures and desperate calculations, while rulers delayed meaningful action, hoping the problem would resolve itself through divine intervention or sheer wishful thinking, or perhaps the next harvest. Some tablets hint at political dysfunction, competing palace centers failing to coordinate responses, resources hoarded rather than shared. Others suggest a kind of cognitive dissonance, an inability of the elite to reconcile the crisis described in administrative documents with their own lived experience of continued comfort and luxury. The palace system had always provided. Surely it would continue to provide. The alternative was literally unthinkable, until it wasn't. The palaces burned, most of them within a generation. Whether the fires came from external invaders, internal revolts, or simple abandonment followed by accident hardly matters. The civilization was already dead. The fires just made it official. The elaborate frescoes, the imported luxuries, the sophisticated bureaucratic systems, all of it reduced to ash and fragments. What survived were the tablets, fired hard by destruction, preserving for archaeologists 3,000 years later the detailed record of a collapse everyone saw coming and no one could stop. Foresight squandered by greed, by hierarchy, by the structural inability of those at the top to imagine their own system's fragility, by the assumption that wealth and power were permanent conditions rather than temporary arrangements requiring constant maintenance and adaptation, by the fatal distance between those who held power and those who bore the consequences of their decisions. The same dynamics would play out centuries later, in a different hemisphere, in a city built on an unprecedented scale where different administrators would compile different records documenting remarkably similar failures. The sun beats down on the avenue of the dead with an intensity that shimmers the air, turning distant pyramids into mirages that waver and dance in the heat. Incense smoke curls from the temple of Quetzalcoatl, where priests perform daily rituals calibrated to astronomical precision, their observations recorded in codices and encoded in architectural alignments. Teotihuacan, at its height, is home to perhaps 150,000 people. In one of the largest cities on Earth, a metropolis whose scale wouldn't be matched in the Americas for centuries. Its murals depict a complex cosmology of gods and natural forces in brilliant pigments that still astonish modern viewers. Its trade network stretched to the Maya lowlands and beyond. Obsidian from its workshops found in archaeological sites across Mesoamerica. The city pulses with life, with markets and ceremonies, with the constant traffic of pilgrims and merchants. The Pyramid of the Sun dominates the landscape, a man-made mountain asserting human ambition against the sky, and its residents are slowly, methodically planning their departure. The official story calls it sudden abandonment, a mysterious collapse that puzzled generations of archaeologists. They found evidence of controlled burning in elite districts, fires that consume palace compounds and administrative buildings, but left residential areas largely intact, suggesting the residents themselves set the fires before leaving. But why? What could make a thriving metropolis, a city that had endured for centuries, voluntarily erase itself? What catastrophe or terror could drive such an orderly evacuation? The answer lies in those astronomical calculations the priests performed with such precision, in the knowledge systems that modern scholarship is only beginning to decode. Murals in residential compounds show unusual iconography in their later phases, subtle but unmistakable shifts in artistic emphasis. The rain god Tlaloc, once ubiquitous in Teotihuacan's religious imagery, appears less frequently in later paintings. Images of drought, of cracked earth spreading like wounds across the landscape, of withered maize plants and empty granaries become more common in the city's final decades. These aren't just artistic choices or stylistic evolution. They are documentary evidence of environmental stress translated into religious symbolism, warnings encoded in the visual language of Mesoamerican cosmology. Archaeoastronomical analysis of Teotihuacan's alignments reveals something striking. The city's major structures track long-term climate cycles with remarkable accuracy. The Pyramid of the Sun aligns not just with solar positions relevant to agricultural calendars, but with cosmic cycles the Mesoamerican peoples associated with drought, renewal, and agricultural fertility. Astronomical patterns that played out over decades and centuries, far beyond the lifespan of any individual observer. As those cycles shifted, indicating prolonged dry periods ahead, the priest astronomers would have recognized the signs years, perhaps decades, before ordinary residents felt the full impact. Declining rainfall measured season by season, dropping water tables revealed through the performance of wells and springs, soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive farming on the same land, the Earth's fertility declining despite ritual offerings and agricultural innovations. The calculations predicted disaster years in advance, the mathematics of collapse written in the stars. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Skeletal remains from Teotihuacan's later periods show nutritional stress, the biological markers of declining diet quality. Trash deposits reveal changes in food consumption patterns, a shift toward less desirable food sources as preferred staples became scarce. Construction projects slowed and then stopped altogether. Resources diverted from monumental building to more pressing concerns. So the residents made a choice that seems impossible by modern standards, a decision that required both profound foresight and remarkable social cohesion. They would leave their city intact as a monument and seek better land elsewhere, abandoning centuries of accumulated infrastructure rather than face slow starvation. The elite residential compounds were ritually burned, not in conquest or riot, but in ceremony, in deliberate termination. Valuables were sometimes deliberately broken or left behind as offerings, killed objects accompanying the death of the city. This was planned obsolescence on a civilization scale, an organized retreat rather than panicked flight. We can imagine priests chanting omens under smoke-filled skies, while citizens silently packed belongings, taking what could be carried and leaving the rest for archaeology. Families making final offerings at household shrines before abandoning homes their ancestors had occupied for generations. The long processions leaving the city, perhaps over years rather than months, flowing out along the ancient roads like a slow-motion diaspora. The knowledge existed. The predictions were solid, grounded in centuries of astronomical observation and environmental monitoring. The priest astronomers understood what was coming with remarkable clarity. But even with that foreknowledge, even with the advantage of advance warning that most collapsing civilizations never receive, the solution was exodus, not adaptation. Not restructuring their economy or implementing water conservation or developing new agricultural techniques, but abandonment. Perhaps the scale of required adaptation exceeded their institutional capacity. Perhaps the political will didn't exist to implement changes that would have disrupted powerful interests. Perhaps the solutions were technically possible but socially impossible, requiring transformations the society couldn't imagine or accept. Teotihuacan encoded warnings in plain sight, in murals that documented environmental stress, in architecture aligned to cosmic cycles of drought and fertility, in the very bones of the city, then walked away when those warnings proved accurate, leaving behind a magnificent ghost city and a haunting question about the limits of foresight without adaptability. Woodhenge posts cast long shadows across bustling plazas where thousands gather for ceremonies marking solar alignments with precision that rivals European observatories of the same era. Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, sprawls across the Mississippi floodplains with a sophistication that would have impressed medieval Europeans had they known of its existence. The Great Monk's Mound rises in massive earthen tiers, a pyramid temple visible for miles across the floodplain, dominating the landscape like a small mountain built by human hands. The population approaches 20,000, larger than London at the same period, a metropolis thriving in the heart of what modern textbooks would call wilderness. But in the forests surrounding the city, something is visibly wrong. The official narrative describes gradual decline, population slowly drifting away over generations, dispersing to smaller settlements scattered across the Mississippi watershed. The decline framed as organic, natural, inevitable. The normal life cycle of cities, nothing to be explained or understood beyond the vague notion that all things must pass. Environmental archaeology tells a more specific story, one written in soil layers and pollen grains, and the chemical signatures preserved in ancient bones. Pollen samples from sediment cores reveal catastrophic deforestation in the decades leading to Cahokia's decline. The forests that once surrounded the city for miles in every direction were systematically cleared for firewood to heat thousands of homes through harsh winters, for construction timber for the endless building projects, for agricultural land to feed a growing population, and with the forests went the soil stability. Erosion accelerated dramatically. Topsoil washed into the Mississippi in muddy floods. Agricultural yields dropped year by year as the fertile earth literally flowed away. The feedback loop was merciless. Declining yields required clearing more land, which caused more erosion, which further reduced yields. Each attempted solution amplified the underlying crisis. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains shows dietary stress increasing over time with mathematical precision. Early Cahokia residents had varied, protein-rich diets, fish from the river, game from the forests, diverse crops from fertile fields. Late-period skeletons show unmistakable signs of malnutrition, increased reliance on maize monoculture, the biological markers of seasonal hunger. The city was literally eating itself out of existence through unsustainable resource extraction, consuming its environmental capital until nothing remained but debt. And they documented it, leaving records for archaeologists to decipher centuries later. Shell disc artworks from the site show changing imagery in the final century, evolution that tracks environmental decline. Earlier pieces depict abundance, full granaries overflowing with grain, successful hunts bringing home deer and elk, prosperous agriculture yielding varied crops. Later pieces show empty hands reaching upward, broken circles symbolizing disrupted cycles, explicit imagery of scarcity that becomes more common as the decades pass. This wasn't aesthetic evolution or changing artistic fashion. It was environmental reporting through art, warnings encoded in shell and copper. The Woodhenge solar calendar itself represents a kind of predictive technology, an astronomical instrument built from timber and human observation. The posts marked not just seasons for planting and harvest, but longer cycle patterns, flood patterns on the Mississippi, drought cycles that played out over decades, the years of plenty and scarcity that ancient agricultural societies tracked with the attention modern economists give to market trends. The priest astronomers who maintained the Woodhenge would have recognized what their measurements were telling them. The agricultural surplus that had built Cahokia was ending, the environmental foundation crumbling beneath the city's weight. Archaeological evidence suggests the departure wasn't panicked flight, but organized withdrawal. Families left heirlooms behind in abandoned structures, ceremonial objects cached as though for eventual return. Not all at once, but steadily, inexorably, households making individual decisions that aggregated into civilizational collapse, as the environmental calculations resolved into stark reality that no amount of ceremony or social cohesion could alter. Human foresight existed, the ability to track environmental degradation through pollen counts and soil quality, to measure its pace through declining yields and spreading erosion, to predict the outcome through astronomical observations and agricultural records. The knowledge was there, encoded in shell artworks and timber calendars and the careful observations of priest astronomers. But the social and economic structures built on unsustainable growth, on the assumption that forests and soil were infinite resources, couldn't be reformed fast enough or thoroughly enough to matter. They could only be abandoned, left behind for smaller, more sustainable settlements. Knowledge unheeded leads to ruin, whether in Illinois or, as we'll see next, in the sophisticated hydraulic systems of Southeast Asia. Waterways glisten under monsoon clouds, reflecting temple spires that pierce the jungle canopy like stone fingers reaching toward the heavens. The hydraulic system of Angkor represents medieval engineering at its finest, an enormous network of reservoirs, canals, and rice paddies that sustains a vast empire through precise water management, calibrated over centuries of trial, error, and accumulated knowledge. During the wet season, the massive Barre reservoirs store water behind earthen embankments that stretch for miles. During the dry season, they release it in controlled flows that irrigate hundreds of square miles of agricultural land, transforming what would be seasonal floodplain into year-round productive farmland. Temple bells ring faintly in the distance, their bronze tones carrying across the water. Prayers rise to Vishnu, to Buddha, to the Devaraja god kings who rule from Angkor Wat and claim cosmic authority over the natural and human worlds. Everything appears eternal, divine, permanent. A civilization blessed by the gods themselves, its prosperity a sign of divine favor. But in the administrative offices tucked behind temple complexes, engineers note troubling patterns in their irrigation records, anomalies that accumulate season by season into undeniable trends. The official story blames Angkor's decline on Thai invasion from Ayutthaya in 1431, a military defeat that ended Khmer dominance in Southeast Asia, a foreign army sacking the great capital, forcing the god kings to relocate. It's simpler that way, more satisfying as narrative. External enemies make better villains than systemic failure. The hydraulic records tell a different story, one that begins decades before any Thai army marched through the jungle, before the first siege tower appeared on the horizon. Sediment analysis from the reservoir systems reveals a civilization slowly drowning in its own success, a victim of its own engineering prowess. The waterworks had become so extensive that they were altering local hydrology in ways the original designers never anticipated. Sediment buildup in the Barres was reducing storage capacity year by year, the reservoirs literally filling themselves in with the soil they captured. The canals required constant maintenance that was becoming increasingly difficult to coordinate across a sprawling empire where political authority was fragmenting and resources were stretched thin, and climate patterns were shifting, monsoons becoming less predictable in their timing and intensity, dry seasons extending beyond their historical norms. The hydraulic system had been designed for one climate regime and was now operating in another, its carefully calibrated flows no longer matching the realities of rainfall and evaporation. Engineers noted these changes in maintenance logs etched into stone or recorded in palm leaf manuscripts long since rotted away. They recommended repairs, expansion, modifications to adapt the system to changing conditions. Some warnings were heeded, resulting in the elaborate expansions visible in Angkor's later phases. New reservoirs, reinforced embankments, additional canals branching from the main arteries. The archaeological evidence shows desperate attempts to maintain the system, but other recommendations were ignored, lost in bureaucratic complexity, or deemed too expensive when the empire was funding massive temple construction projects that glorified kings but did nothing for water management. Resources flowed toward the visible, the monumental, the prestigious, not toward the mundane maintenance that actually sustained the population. One engineer's report, preserved in a stone inscription at Ta Prohm Temple, reads with bureaucratic precision. The water gates require strengthening. The western canal silts heavily. If not cleared before the rains, flooding will damage the lower city. The inscription is dated 30 years before the Thai invasion, 3 decades of advance warning carved into stone and apparently ignored. Engineers writing urgent reports while kings commissioned new temple carvings, prioritizing religious monuments over infrastructure maintenance, divine prestige over hydraulic necessity. The pattern repeats across civilizations, technical experts raising alarms, while political leaders pursue other priorities until crisis becomes catastrophe. The hydraulic system that had sustained Angkor for centuries was failing incrementally, predictably, measurably. Agricultural yields declined as irrigation became unreliable. Population concentrated in areas where water management still functioned, abandoning regions where the canals had silted beyond repair. The empire was contracting, weakening, losing the agricultural surplus that funded its armies and its monumental architecture. When the Thai army did arrive in 1431, they found a civilization already weakened by decades of environmental and infrastructural collapse. The military defeat was the final chapter, not the primary cause. The conquest merely formalized what had already happened, the end of Angkor as a viable political and economic system. Angkor's collapse was inscribed in its infrastructure, visible to anyone who understood water management, predictable to those who analyzed the sediment data and rainfall patterns, and ignored by those with the power to prevent it until prevention became impossible and only abandonment remained. Desert wind brushes over ceremonial pyramids that rise like mountains from the Peruvian coastal plain, their adobe bricks painted in colors that once blazed brilliant in the harsh sunlight. Painted murals show gods and demons locked in cosmic struggles, scenes of warfare and fertility intertwined, elaborate rituals involving prisoners and sacrifice performed with meticulous attention to detail. The Moche civilization thrives in a landscape that seems fundamentally hostile to human settlement. Northern Peru, caught between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes, sustained by narrow river valleys that ribbon through otherwise barren terrain, like green veins in a body of sand. But those rivers are the key to everything, and the Moche understand this with a clarity that borders on obsession, a hydrological awareness embedded in every aspect of their culture. The official narrative describes Moche decline as sudden, almost inexplicable, perhaps caused by catastrophic El Niño flooding events that overwhelmed their infrastructure. Perhaps political fragmentation as competing regional centers vied for diminishing resources. Perhaps simply the shift in power to the expanding Wari culture from the highlands. Events beyond prediction or control, the standard explanations for civilizational collapse. The murals themselves suggest the Moche saw it coming, with remarkable precision. Recent analysis of painted imagery on pyramid walls reveals a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once recognized. Early Moche art depicts stable agricultural scenes, organized irrigation systems feeding geometrically perfect fields, bountiful harvests being stored in carefully rendered granaries, gods blessing the crops with benevolent expressions and gestures. The tone is one of prosperity, harmony, cosmic balance maintained through proper ritual observance. But in the later phases, around 500 to 600 CE, the iconography changes dramatically. Floods dominate the imagery, torrential waters sweeping away fields and structures, chaos replacing order. Skeletal figures appear with increasing frequency, death personified and multiplied. Prisoners are sacrificed in increasing numbers according to the visual record, their blood offered to gods depicted with increasingly angry expressions, divine faces contorted in rage or disappointment or hunger. This wasn't just artistic evolution or changing aesthetic preferences. It was documentary escalation, a civilization recording its own crisis in the only permanent medium available, painted adobe and ceramic vessels that would survive millennia. Archaeological evidence confirms what the art implied with disturbing precision. Irrigation layers excavated from canal systems show massive flood deposits from catastrophic El Niño events around 560 CE and again around 650 CE. These weren't ordinary seasonal floods that could be managed with standard infrastructure. They were civilization-ending disasters that devastated the carefully maintained canal systems accumulated over centuries, washed away topsoil that had taken generations to build up through careful agricultural management, destroyed crops across entire valleys, and fundamentally undermined the agricultural base of Moche society in ways that couldn't be quickly repaired. But here's what makes this case remarkable, what elevates it beyond simple environmental determinism. The Moche could predict El Niño events with practical accuracy. They didn't have the scientific framework we use, obviously. No understanding of ocean temperatures or atmospheric pressure systems or the Walker circulation. But they had centuries of observation, careful pattern recognition, cyclical understanding passed down through generations of priests and farmers. They knew that every few decades, with grim regularity, the gods would send catastrophic flooding. They knew the signs, changes in fish populations, alterations in bird behavior, shifts in wind patterns. They built their entire religious system around managing this relationship, sacrifices to appease the storm gods, rituals to ensure proper rainfall patterns, blood offerings to maintain cosmic balance and prevent divine anger. The archaeological record is explicit. Skeletal trauma records show human sacrifice increasing exponentially in Moche's final century, not because they became more brutal or their religious beliefs fundamentally changed, but because ritual was their predictive technology, their attempt to alter outcomes they could see approaching but couldn't otherwise control through engineering or political organization. The priests weren't ignorant, they were desperate, escalating their responses to match the escalating crisis they saw coming. More prisoners sacrificed, more elaborate ceremonies, more blood offered to gods whose anger seemed implacable. The predictions proved accurate. The floods came precisely when the cyclical patterns suggested they would. But the solutions proved useless, ritual unable to redirect weather systems or reinforce irrigation infrastructure against catastrophic flows, priests bleeding ritual warnings into the sand, knowing floods were coming based on centuries of observation, believing sacrifice might prevent or mitigate them, watching their predictions prove accurate while their solutions proved inadequate to the scale of disaster. Ritual foresight failed to protect society when the scale of disaster exceeded the scale of response, when prediction without practical adaptation meant only the ability to watch collapse approach with eyes wide open. Sun-bleached cliff dwellings rise in tiers, their stone walls fitting together with geometric precision that still impresses modern architects. Wind moans through Pueblo Bonito's empty corridors, through the great kivas where ceremonies once synchronized an entire culture's spiritual calendar with celestial movements tracked across generations. Chaco Canyon, in what is now New Mexico, represents one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian societies in North America. The great houses aren't just buildings, they're astronomical observatories aligned to solar and lunar standstills, ritual centers where pilgrimages converge from across the region, administrative hubs for a trade network spanning hundreds of miles that brought macaw feathers from Mexico and shells from the Pacific coast. The official story calls it gradual migration, environmental changes making the canyon less hospitable over time, so people slowly moved elsewhere seeking better conditions. A gentle narrative, organic, inevitable. The natural ebb and flow of human settlement patterns across a challenging landscape. The walls themselves tell a more deliberate story, one of knowledge and warning ignored. Carved into stone panels throughout Chaco are petroglyphs that encode environmental data with remarkable sophistication, spiral patterns that some researchers now believe track solar cycles with mathematical precision. Concentric circles that may represent drought cycles observed and recorded over centuries. Geometric patterns that don't match known decorative motifs, but do match mathematical sequences associated with long-term climate prediction. Visual calendars that functioned as warning systems. Tree ring analysis, dendrochronology, has revolutionized our understanding of Chaco's decline, providing year-by-year precision that few other archaeological sites can match. The tree rings show exactly what the ancestral Puebloans would have known from direct observation. A mega-drought beginning around 1130 CE that devastated the Southwest. Not a single bad year that could be weathered through stored reserves, but a sustained 50-year drought that made agriculture in the canyon increasingly impossible, that turned reliable springs into dry holes and reduced the Chaco wash to cracked earth. But the tree rings reveal something else that transforms our understanding. Earlier droughts of similar magnitude had occurred within cultural memory. The ancestral Puebloans had weathered drought cycles before, had survived previous periods of climate stress through careful resource management and social cooperation. They knew the patterns intimately. Some of the petroglyphs appear to track these cycles across generations, encoding knowledge of when the good years and bad years would arrive based on astronomical observations and accumulated environmental data. This wasn't a civilization blindsided by unprecedented climate change. This was a society that understood cyclical environmental stress and had developed systems to predict and respond to it. The elders who carved warnings into canyon walls knew what was coming, could read the signs in rainfall patterns and spring flows, and the behavior of plants and animals. The question isn't whether they could predict drought. The petroglyphs and the sophistication of their astronomical observations prove they could. The question is whether they could persuade their society to act on those predictions, to abandon a sacred landscape and elaborate infrastructure before conditions became desperate. Cave inscriptions from the canyon's final occupied phase show increasingly desperate rituals, religious responses escalating as environmental conditions deteriorated. Offerings multiply. The ceremonial calendar intensifies with more frequent and elaborate ceremonies, and construction actually increases in the decades before final abandonment, as if building more great houses might reverse the climate through sheer architectural will, might bring the rains back through proper devotion and monumental effort. The archaeological evidence suggests cognitive dissonance on a civilizational scale, knowledge of impending disaster coexisting with behaviors that assume continued prosperity. Resources poured into construction even as water sources failed. Ceremonies intensified even as their ineffectiveness became undeniable. Knowledge existed. The warnings were literally carved in stone, petroglyphs encoding environmental data that anyone trained to read them could interpret. The predictive capacity was there, honed through centuries of careful observation. But action, meaningful adaptation to the environmental reality, planned relocation before crisis forced it, did not materialize in time or at sufficient scale. The ancestral Puebloans left Chaco not because they were surprised by drought, but because they couldn't overcome the inertia of cultural practice even when they knew the land could no longer sustain them. The great houses remained sacred. The ceremonial calendar remained fixed. The investment in place was too great to abandon preemptively, even when the petroglyphs warned that abandonment was inevitable. By the time the canyon was finally deserted around 1150 CE, the departure was less organized migration than the desperate dispersal, families and clans scattering to river valleys and more reliable water sources, the integrated regional system fragmenting into smaller, isolated communities. And halfway across the world, another civilization was carving its own warnings into stone towers, documenting environmental crisis even as it proved unable to escape it. Stone towers rise from savanna fog, dry-fitted granite walls curving in massive concentric circles that speak of engineering sophistication and centralized authority accumulated over generations. Great Zimbabwe, the largest stone structure in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, commands trade routes between the interior goldfields and the Swahili coast with strategic precision. Ivory, gold, and iron flow through the city in steady streams. Imported ceramics from as far as Persia and China appear in elite compounds, material evidence of connections spanning the Indian Ocean trade network. Glass beads, copper ingots, fine cloth. The archaeological record shows wealth concentrated at unprecedented levels. This is power made visible in architecture, authority expressed through stone. But the granaries are half empty and have been for years. The administrators know, the scribes document it, the people feel it. The official narrative describes abandonment around 1450 CE due to external pressures beyond anyone's control, trade routes shifting to more advantageous locations, regional powers rising elsewhere, drawing commerce away from Zimbabwe's sphere of influence. The center of gravity moving away from Great Zimbabwe's strategic location through the inexorable logic of economic geography. No one's fault, just the natural evolution of commercial networks. Archaeological surveys tell a more intimate story of ecological collapse, one written in soil chemistry and settlement patterns and the desperate measures visible in the material record. Soil analysis from the Zimbabwe Plateau reveals severe degradation in the centuries leading to abandonment, the earth literally exhausted by intensive agriculture. The population of Great Zimbabwe at its peak may have reached 18,000 people, an enormous concentration for the region, far beyond what the local environment could sustainably support. That population required food, firewood for cooking and metalworking, building materials for continuous construction, and water for drinking and irrigation. The surrounding landscape was systematically exploited to meet those needs, resources extracted faster than natural processes could replenish them. The result? Deforestation that spread in expanding rings around the city as residents traveled farther each year to find timber. Soil exhaustion as fields were cultivated without adequate fallow periods, the nutrients mined from earth until it could no longer support crops. Water source depletion as springs were overtapped and watershed degradation reduced aquifer recharge. The environmental accounting was brutal and precise. Settlement patterns show the crisis unfolding incrementally, visible in the archaeological record like frames in slow-motion film. Rural villages surrounding Great Zimbabwe were abandoned first, their populations likely migrating to the city, hoping for better conditions, for access to stored food reserves and trade goods, but concentrating more people in. The urban center only accelerated resource depletion, creating more mouths to feed from a shrinking agricultural base. It's a pattern we see repeatedly across collapsed civilizations. Ecological stress drives centralization, which drives further ecological stress, creating a feedback loop that ultimately collapses the system entirely. The elite residents of Great Zimbabwe weren't stupid or ignorant. They could see the forests receding year by year, the springs drying up or flowing less reliably, the agricultural yields declining despite constant labor. The evidence was undeniable to anyone paying attention. Evidence suggests they responded by intensifying control over remaining resources, hoarding wealth in the great enclosure, tightening trade monopolies to maintain their privileged position, maintaining appearances of prosperity even as the foundation crumbled beneath the impressive stone walls. One stone inscription near the great enclosure, only recently translated with improved understanding of the local script, appears to be an administrator's inventory. It lists food stores with meticulous precision, import shipments expected from the coast, and notably, relief rations distributed to specific populations. The dating suggests this inscription comes from the final decades of occupation, perhaps within a generation of final abandonment. They were managing scarcity, documenting it with bureaucratic thoroughness, allocating what remained according to hierarchical priorities that favored the elite. Leaders hoarding wealth as ordinary citizens fled to rural areas with better water and soil, the stone towers standing as monuments to power, while the people who built them, who quarried and shaped and fitted those massive granite blocks, scattered to regions where survival seemed more certain. The city foresaw its end through environmental accounting that was detailed and accurate, but the solution would have required admitting decline, abandoning the symbol of power that was the stone enclosure itself, accepting that even great civilizations can become ecologically unviable. That admission never came officially. No royal decree announced the end. No formal abandonment ceremony marked the transition. The elite simply left, perhaps maintaining the fiction to the last, that this was temporary, that they would return when conditions improved. The stones remain, empty testimony to a society that saw the end approaching through careful documentation, that understood the environmental mathematics of collapse, but couldn't speak it aloud or act on it decisively enough to matter. High-altitude winds sweep across stone platforms, where the gateway of the sun stands sentinel, its carved figures staring into perpetual distance with expressions that have puzzled archaeologists for generations. Tiwanaku, built at 13,000 feet near Lake Titicaca, shouldn't exist by conventional agricultural logic. Agriculture at this altitude is marginal at best, the growing season brutally short, frost a constant threat even in summer months. Yet somehow this civilization supported tens of thousands of people through sophisticated raised field agriculture that harnessed microclimates and water management with engineering precision that modern agronomists still admire. The lake itself is everything, the alpha and omega of Tiwanaku civilization. Water source for irrigation and drinking, fish protein supplementing high-altitude crops, climate moderator that buffers temperature extremes and extends growing seasons, spiritual center where the sacred and practical merge seamlessly. The Tiwanaku built their entire civilization around the careful management of this relationship, their survival dependent on understanding and working with the lake's rhythms. The official story describes gradual decline around 1000 CE with frustrating vagueness. Perhaps a drought dried their fields. Perhaps political fragmentation weakened centralized authority. Perhaps competition from rival centers drew away population and resources. The usual explanatory categories applied when evidence seems ambiguous. But sediment cores from Lake Titicaca tell a precise story of environmental predictions proven tragically accurate, of knowledge that existed but couldn't translate into salvation. The cores show lake levels dropping steadily over a century before Tiwanaku's collapse, a slow-motion catastrophe visible to anyone who paid attention. This wasn't sudden climate shock. The residents would have watched the shoreline recede meter by meter, year by year, the waterline marked perhaps by posts or stones that recorded its inexorable retreat. Their raised field agricultural system depended on carefully calibrated water levels maintained through sophisticated hydraulic engineering. Too high, and the fields flood, drowning crops. Too low, and they dry out, the carefully constructed microclimate disrupted. The system had no tolerance for the kind of sustained drought that began around 950 CE. Stone monuments at Tiwanaku show evidence of later phase construction that seems almost desperate in its ambition and scale. Reservoirs were expanded beyond their original footprints, earthworks carved to capture every possible drop of water. New water management systems were carved directly into bedrock, permanent infrastructure meant to outlast the crisis. The Gateway of the Sun itself may have been repositioned during this period, perhaps as part of ritual attempts to restore the climate through proper astronomical alignment, to bring the cosmic order back into balance through human effort. Ritual offerings escalated dramatically in frequency and scale. Archaeological excavations have found massive deposits of sacrificial materials, llama bones by the thousands, pottery vessels deliberately smashed, precious metals and textiles, concentrated in the decades before final abandonment. These weren't celebrations of prosperity or routine religious observances. They were negotiations with gods who controlled water, desperate attempts to bargain for the rain and snowmelt that no longer came in sufficient quantities. Agricultural specialists would have understood exactly what was happening with scientific precision. The dropping lake levels, combined with declining rainfall measurable in crop yields and spring flows, meant the raised field system would fail within a generation. They could measure it through direct observation, calculate it through accumulated knowledge of hydrology and agriculture, predict the timeline of collapse with accuracy that rivals modern modeling. And they did the only thing their worldview allowed. They ritualized the prediction, turned environmental data into religious ceremony, transformed mathematical certainty into appeals to divine power, and hoped that supernatural intervention might reverse natural processes. The solution they could imagine was spiritual rather than practical: more offerings, better rituals, proper astronomical alignments. When abandonment came around 1000 CE, it was orderly and deliberate rather than panicked. The stone monuments were left intact, no evidence of destruction or desecration. The residential areas were gradually emptied over years or decades, households making individual decisions that aggregated into civilizational dissolution. People migrated to lower altitudes where water remained more reliable, where lake levels hadn't dropped as catastrophically, where agriculture could continue. Tiwanaku became a ghost city not through conquest or sudden disaster, but through environmental accounting. When the calculations proved the high-altitude experiment was ending, people left. The stones remain, erected by engineers who understood hydrology and agriculture, maintained by priests who tracked astronomical cycles, abandoned by a population who saw their own end, reflected in declining lake levels, but couldn't engineer their way out of drought or ritualize their way back to adequate rainfall. Knowledge existed, prediction was accurate, but solution required either climate engineering beyond their capacity or wholesale migration that would abandon centuries of accumulated infrastructure and sacred landscape, and the latter came too late to be anything but retreat. Icy fjords stretch between mountains where Norse settlements cling to coastal valleys, small clusters of turf-roofed longhouses that seem impossibly fragile against the landscape's brutal magnificence. Skeletal remains of livestock lie frozen in snowdrifts near abandoned barns, preserved by cold that prevented even decomposition. The Norse Greenlanders, descendants of Eric the Red's adventurous colonization around 985 CE, have survived here for 4 centuries through sheep farming, limited barley agriculture in the brief summers, hunting seals and caribou, and crucial trade with Iceland and Norway that brings timber, iron, and grain they cannot produce themselves. But the ships have stopped coming with their necessary regularity, and the climate is shifting in ways that make survival increasingly mathematical, a problem of declining resources measured against fixed human needs. The official story blames isolation and climate change with neat simplicity. The medieval warm period that made Greenland marginally habitable for European-style agriculture ended around 1300 CE. The Little Ice Age began, temperatures dropping degree by degree. Sea ice expanded, blocking harbors for longer each year. Life became impossible for European-style farming in an environment that had always been marginal at best. That's true, but incomplete. The written records that survived, farm logs kept by literate landowners, sagas recording family histories, church documents sent back to Norway, show the Norse Greenlanders watching their own decline with documentary precision that makes their fate almost unbearably poignant. They weren't blindsided by climate change arriving without warning. They were documenting it as it happened, year by year, season by season, calculating with grim accuracy how many more winters they could endure before mathematics resolved into starvation. Farm records describe steadily declining hay yields measured against livestock needs, sheep herds producing less wool, less meat, fewer viable offspring, as grazing lands shrank and nutritional stress increased. The growing season shortening by weeks, then months, the window for successful harvest closing like a trap. These aren't retrospective observations written by later historians. They're contemporary accounting, written by people tracking their own viability with the careful attention survival demands. One saga fragment, preserved at the cathedral in Bergen, Norway, describes a Greenland farmer writing to relatives in Iceland. 3 ships were expected this summer. None arrived. The ice came early. Our winter stores will not last. Send word if this letter reaches you. The letter reached Bergen. No rescue came. They knew isolation was killing them as surely as cold or hunger. They knew the climate was shifting beyond their adaptive capacity, that the environmental conditions that had made colonization possible were disappearing. They knew, with the brutal clarity that Arctic survival demands, that their settlement was entering its final phase, that within a generation or two, the farms would be abandoned and the churches empty. And still they stayed. Norwegian identity, Christian faith, and stubborn pride kept them clinging to farms that yielded less each year, to a way of life that was becoming objectively unviable. The Inuit, native to the Arctic and adapted to its demands over millennia, thrived in the same landscape by following radically different survival strategies: seal hunting from kayaks, seasonal migration following game, flexible adaptation to changing conditions, diet and shelter technologies suited to the environment. The Norse watched the Inuit survive where they were failing, observed their techniques, sometimes traded with them. But the Norse couldn't or wouldn't adopt those strategies because doing so would mean admitting they were no longer Norwegian farmers, but something else. Would mean abandoning the cultural identity that justified their presence in Greenland. Better to starve as Christians and Norwegians than survive as something unrecognizable. Families starved while trading ships failed to arrive, their deaths not sudden but incremental. Predicted in their own farm logs, calculated season by season as stores dwindled and spring refused to come early enough to save them. Warnings chronicled with documentary precision, environmental mathematics understood and recorded, but ignored due to stubborn cultural pride that made adaptation impossible and death preferable to transformation. Moai stare at the horizon with blank stone eyes, their backs to the center of the island, their faces toward the sea they will never cross. Deforested hills roll behind them under a sun that beats relentlessly on exposed soil, no longer shaded by the palm forests that once covered this landscape. Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth, over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land, is in the process of demonstrating exactly how civilizational collapse looks when there's nowhere else to go, when migration isn't an option and adaptation is the only alternative to extinction. The Moai themselves are the key to understanding that the people predicted what was coming. The official story treats Easter Island as a cautionary tale of environmental destruction, perhaps the most famous such narrative in popular consciousness. A society that cut down all its trees for statue transport, destroyed its own resource base through short-sighted exploitation, and collapsed into warfare and cannibalism. It's often framed as a surprising disaster. They didn't know what they were doing, didn't understand the consequences until it was too late. But the Moai themselves, analyzed as a chronological sequence rather than a uniform phenomenon, suggest otherwise. Recent archaeological analysis reveals that Moai construction patterns changed dramatically in the later period. The statues became smaller, less elaborate, their carving less refined. Construction shifted from the massive Ahu platforms that required enormous communal labor to smaller, rougher installations that could be completed with fewer resources. Some Moai were abandoned mid-transport, left lying on ancient roads in various stages of completion, the logistics apparently becoming impossible. This wasn't continuity of tradition. It was tradition breaking down under resource constraints that became increasingly impossible to ignore. Soil analysis shows catastrophic deforestation occurring over centuries in waves of clearing. The island's palm forests didn't vanish overnight in some sudden catastrophe. They were cut systematically, progressively, visibly, for rollers to transport moai, for firewood, for construction, for agriculture. Each generation would have seen fewer trees than their parents' generation, the forest retreating toward the crater lakes and volcanic slopes. The trajectory was obvious to anyone paying attention, as undeniable as the moai themselves. Pollen cores from volcanic crater lakes show the palm population declining steadily from 1200 CE onward with brutal clarity. By 1500 CE, the palms were functionally extinct on the island. Without trees, the islanders couldn't build the fishing canoes that had provided crucial protein. Without canoes, marine resources became inaccessible. Diet quality declined. Without forests, soil erosion accelerated catastrophically. Agricultural productivity dropped as topsoil washed away. The spiral was self-reinforcing and clearly divisible. The moai represent a society that knew these changes were coming but couldn't stop the momentum of their own status system, couldn't break the machinery of prestige competition. Each clan competed for social standing through statue construction, through the ability to carve and transport larger moai to more prominent ahu platforms. Stopping moai production would mean admitting decline, losing face in interclan competition, breaking the social contracts that held power structures together and validated chiefly authority, so they kept building, kept cutting the dwindling trees, kept following practices they could calculate were unsustainable, given the island's finite resources. Some of the final moai show signs of hasty, crude construction, as if the builders were rushing to complete traditional monuments before the resources ran out entirely, checking boxes on ritual obligations, even as the system collapsed. We can imagine priests and elders carving warnings into rocks as forests visibly disappeared around them, as the last groves shrank year by year. Not secret warnings hidden in esoteric symbolism, visible, obvious, calculable warnings that everyone on a small island could verify through direct observation, simply by comparing the present landscape to living memory. The moai aren't just statues or religious monuments. They're evidence of a civilization that encoded its own doom in stone, that continued the practices causing collapse even while documenting the decline, knowing the warnings wouldn't be heeded because the social cost of heeding them, abandoning the status competition that structured their entire society, was too high until it was too late to matter. Temple steps bake under relentless sun, the limestone reflecting heat and waves that distort the jungle beyond into shimmering uncertainty. Glyphs etched into stelae record dynastic histories, astronomical calculations, ritual calendars of impossible complexity that track Venus cycles and eclipse patterns with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The Maya lowlands at their height represent one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. Mathematics, including the concept of zero, astronomy of remarkable accuracy, a fully functional writing system, architecture that still awes modern visitors, all flourishing in a jungle environment that seems determined to reclaim human order with every monsoon season. And that's exactly what those glyphs are documenting in their final chapters: the jungle's return, the collapse they saw coming. The official narrative calls it the Maya collapse, sudden abandonment around 900 CE that depopulated the southern lowlands. Cities that housed tens of thousands reduced to empty temples and vine-covered palaces within a generation or two. The mystery has spawned countless theories: warfare between city-states, epidemic disease, even Spanish conquest, despite occurring 6 centuries too early, and in particularly desperate moments, alien intervention. But the glyphs themselves, once scholars achieved fuller translation of the Maya script, tell us what happened. They were documenting it in real time, recording their own decline with the same precision they'd applied to tracking celestial movements. Lake sediment cores from the Yucatan reveal severe drought cycles between 800 and 1000 CE, the physical evidence preserved in layers of clay and pollen. multiple decades-long droughts separated by only brief recovery periods insufficient to rebuild reserves. The hydrological stress would have been catastrophic for civilizations, dependent on seasonal rains filling reservoirs and cenote water sources in a landscape with no permanent rivers. But here's the crucial detail that transforms this from natural disaster to predicted catastrophe. The Maya were tracking these patterns with systematic attention. Glyphic inscriptions from the late Classic period include increasingly frequent references to drought, failed crops, divine displeasure expressed through withheld rain. One inscription at Copan reads, "The rain does not fall in its season. The maize withers. The gods turn their faces away." This isn't religious metaphor obscuring ignorance. It's climate reporting, wrapped in the religious language that structured Maya understanding of causation. The Maya long count calendar tracked cycles far beyond human lifespans. Centuries, millennia, cosmic epochs of creation and destruction. The priest astronomers understood cyclical time with mathematical precision, understood that the drought patterns had precedents clearly visible in historical records, could be predicted through astronomical observation. Combined with careful record keeping, they knew hard times were coming because hard times had come before, in regular intervals, encoded in their calendars and preserved in their chronicles. Political inscriptions from the collapse period show increasing warfare between city-states, documented battles, and captive-taking ceremonies. But this wasn't random violence or traditional status competition. It was desperate competition over declining resources. As agricultural yields dropped across the region, cities raided each other for stored grain, control of water sources, access to remaining arable land. The warfare was a symptom, not the cause, violence triggered by scarcity. We can imagine rulers receiving urgent envoys from provincial areas reporting crop failures, water shortages, population beginning to drift away. And those rulers, based on the inscriptions we can still read carved into their monuments, responded with ritual intensification, more ceremonies performed with greater frequency, more sacrifices to appease the rain god, Chak, more appeals to gods who were, from the ruler's perspective, embedded in their cosmology, the only powers capable of reversing climate patterns. The drought patterns were predictable through cycles the Maya had documented. The glyphic records show clearly that Maya astronomer priests predicted them with practical accuracy. But the solution? Dramatic depopulation, abandonment of unsustainable cities that had grown beyond environmental carrying capacity, reorganization into smaller settlements with reduced resource demands, required admitting that the grand urban experiment of the Classic period had failed. That admission came eventually, but not as coordinated policy or planned transition. It came as exodus, as scattered abandonment, as silence gradually filling the great plazas where ceremonies had echoed for centuries, as jungle reclaimed temples within decades. The collapse was written in glyphic code across walls and stelae, and those who could read the code watched it unfold exactly as astronomical cycles and historical patterns had predicted, powerless or unwilling to alter the trajectory. Carved sandstone streets echo with wind, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic that has long since ceased, polished by thousands upon thousands of footsteps that will never come again. Cisterns carved into rock faces stand dry, their careful engineering now testament to a water management system that once seemed miraculous, that allowed civilization to flourish where it shouldn't exist. Petra, the Rose City, commanded trade routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean through mastery of one resource, water. In a landscape where water should be impossible to concentrate in sufficient quantities for urban life. The Nabateans didn't just survive in the desert, they thrived through hydraulic engineering so sophisticated that it allowed them to maintain a city of 20,000 people in one of the driest regions on Earth, turning geology and meteorology into reliable infrastructure. But their own engineering records, carved into cistern walls and aqueduct channels with the same precision they applied to the system itself, document the infrastructure's gradual failure with bureaucratic clarity. The official story blames trade route changes for Petra's decline. When the Romans redirected commerce through different paths and developed maritime routes that bypassed the desert caravans, Petra's economic base collapsed. It's a clean narrative of geopolitical shifts beyond local control, of economic forces too large for any single city to resist. But rock-cut inscriptions tell a more immediate story of water scarcity and engineering warnings ignored by distant administrators. The Nabatean water system relied on capturing flash floods in the wadis, storing runoff in rock-cut cisterns, and distributing it through channels carved into the sandstone with mathematical precision. It required constant maintenance, careful calculation of seasonal rainfall patterns, and precise understanding of the desert's hydrology. For centuries, from Petra's founding until Roman annexation, it worked brilliantly. Analysis of the cistern inscriptions shows maintenance records becoming increasingly urgent in the final century of Nabatean independence, and especially after Roman annexation in 106 CE. Notations about sediment buildup, reducing storage capacity. Records of channels requiring repair that hadn't been completed. Documentation of declining water table levels in certain areas. These weren't casual observations by idle engineers. They were urgent warnings from technical experts watching their system degrade. One inscription near the Siku entrance, dated to approximately 300 CE, notes with administrative precision. The western cisterns hold only half their capacity. The channels from Wadi Musa silt heavily. If not cleared before the rains, storage will be insufficient. Petra's engineers knew the system was degrading incrementally. They documented it with the same care they had documented successful operations for centuries. They warned their administrators through the channels available. But by this point, the Nabateans were under Roman control, and Roman priorities didn't necessarily align with local hydraulic maintenance. The infrastructure that had built Petra's wealth was being neglected as resources and administrative attention flowed to Roman projects elsewhere, to roads and aqueducts serving military or imperial purposes. The archaeological evidence shows residential patterns shifting in the city's final occupied phase, people abandoning homes in areas where water distribution had become unreliable, concentrating in neighborhoods still served by functioning cisterns. This wasn't sudden departure triggered by invasion panic, but gradual, calculated evacuation as different parts of the city became unviable for permanent residents. Citizens left personal possessions behind, not from invasion panic, but from the pragmatic realization that staying in an area without reliable water was slow suicide. The luxury goods, the carved furnishings, the architectural magnificence that still draws tourists, all meaningless when the cisterns run dry and the nearest reliable water is miles away. The knowledge existed. The engineering expertise that had sustained Petra for centuries hadn't vanished or been forgotten. The Nabateans still possessed the technical understanding, but knowledge divorced from political power is just documentation of disaster. The warnings were carved in stone where anyone could read them, but the decision-makers were in Rome or other provincial capitals, concerned with empire-scale priorities rather than local hydraulics in an increasingly peripheral city. What prevailed was a particular form of institutional arrogance, the assumption that systems successful for centuries would continue indefinitely without maintenance, that engineering solutions require only initial genius and not constant vigilance and resource allocation. Petra stands now as a monument to both brilliant adaptation and failed maintenance, a civilization that predicted its own end in engineering reports carved into the very infrastructure that was failing, but couldn't marshal the political will or administrative priority to prevent collapse. Snow blows over timber halls that represent some of the most ambitious exploration in human history, structures built with care and then deliberately dismantled. The Norse settlement at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland is Europe's first foothold in the Americas, centuries before Columbus, a beachhead for what some imagined could be a new Norway carved from seemingly endless forests and rich fishing grounds. Hearths go cold. The settlement, established around 1000 CE, is abandoned by 1020 CE, perhaps the shortest-lived colony in this entire list of civilizational failures. The official story treats Vinland as a failed exploration attempt with little deeper analysis. The Norse tried to settle North America, found it too difficult or too dangerous, went home. A simple narrative of failed ambition, of European explorers defeated by wilderness. But the sagas themselves tell us they knew it would fail before they even left Iceland, that this was a calculated risk everyone understood. The saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders written down in the 13th century but preserving oral histories from the settlement period, are remarkably candid about Vinland's problems. The accounts describe conflicts with indigenous peoples, called Skrælings in the sagas, who vastly outnumbered the Norse and opposed their presence. They describe inadequate supplies for long-term settlement. They describe the crushing isolation, thousands of miles from support, and crucially, they describe climate miscalculation. The Norse settlers expected Vinland to be warmer than Greenland based on initial summer explorations that showed lush vegetation and abundant resources. But winter changed that calculation dramatically. Archaeological evidence shows the Lanceau Meadows settlement was built hastily, occupied briefly, perhaps only a single winter or two, then systematically dismantled rather than simply abandoned in panic. They knew before leaving that the experiment was failing. Personal belongings were removed. Valuable iron nails were pulled from timber, too precious to leave behind. The site was stripped of everything portable. This was deliberate withdrawal by people who understood they couldn't sustain the settlement through multiple winters, that the logistics didn't support permanent occupation. Letters preserved in Icelandic archives, copies of originals sent back from Greenland describing the Vinland venture, show surprising honesty about its limitations. One fragment notes, "The land is rich but distant. The winters harsh. The Skrælings numerous and hostile. 3 ships could not carry sufficient supplies. 5 would risk too many lives. The venture cannot succeed without support we do not have." That's not retrospective analysis written by historians centuries later. That's predictive assessment written during or immediately after the attempt. Clear-eyed recognition of failure. The Norse had centuries of experience with marginal settlements. Iceland colonized in the 9th century, Greenland in the late 10th, numerous Atlantic islands. They knew intimately what successful colonization required. Minimum population thresholds to maintain genetic diversity and labor pools, reliable supply lines for goods that couldn't be produced locally, defensible positions against hostile forces, adequate local resources for food and materials. Vinland met essentially none of these criteria, and the expedition leaders knew it from direct observation. Families left personal belongings behind, not in panic, but in pragmatism, taking what could be carried back across the Atlantic, leaving what couldn't, accepting that the experiment had failed exactly as some had predicted it would, before the ships ever sailed west from Greenland. One saga passage captures the mentality perfectly. Karl Sefni said they had discovered a land of great promise, but they could not defend it without greater numbers. Better to return with tales of its riches than bones in its soil. This is civilization anticipating demise through clear-eyed assessment of logistics, climate, and isolation, then acting on that assessment. The calculation was brutally simple. Ambition and courage couldn't overcome geography and numbers. The remarkable thing is that they admitted it, documented it honestly in their sagas, and withdrew in organized fashion while they still had the ships and supplies to do so. Unlike civilizations that denied their own collapse until it consumed them, that ignored warnings until warnings became epitaphs, the Vinland Norse predicted failure, accepted it without illusion, and left while they still could, carrying their knowledge back to Greenland and Iceland as a lesson about the limits of expansion. Monsoon floods wash over temple courtyards, where prayers once rose with incense smoke. Gardens designed to represent cosmic order wilt under water stress. Angkor Wat, the massive temple complex that represents the height of Khmer architectural achievement, sits at the center of a hydraulic system that is systematically failing and has been for decades. The official story credits Angkor's final decline to Thai invasion in 1431, when Ayutthaya forces sacked the capital. Military defeat, clean narrative, external cause. But irrigation canal analysis reveals the civilization was already in collapse mode well before any army arrived. We've discussed Angkor before, but it's worth revisiting because the case is so well documented. The hydraulic engineering that built Angkor's power was also inscribing the record of its own failure. Engineers weren't just building systems, they were documenting performance, maintenance needs, structural degradation. Sediment layers in the main reservoirs show the problems compounding over time. Deforestation in the watershed increased erosion, which increased sediment flowing into the barrays, which reduced storage capacity, which compromised dry season water availability. Each problem fed the next in a cascade that hydraulic engineers would have recognized immediately. Stone inscriptions from the 1300s describe emergency water management measures, channels being dug to redistribute water, reservoirs being dredged at enormous labor cost, the frenetic activity of a civilization trying to save an infrastructure system that had grown too complex to maintain. One inscription at Preah Khan, dated to 1370 CE, is remarkably direct. The western gates fail. Water flows unchecked. The southern channels silt. The engineers plead for resources, but the temples demand offering. When water ceases, hunger follows. That was written 60 years before the Thai invasion. The military defeat was the final collapse of a structure that had been crumbling from within for generations. The pattern is familiar by now. Engineers writing urgent letters to kings who were preoccupied with religious construction, with temple expansion, with the spiritual architecture that would ensure divine favor. The problem wasn't lack of knowledge, it was priority allocation. Maintaining water systems is expensive, unglamorous work. Building temples generates prestige, religious merit, dynastic legacy. When you're a god king whose legitimacy derives from your connection to the divine, investing in canal maintenance is a hard sell compared to building one more temple, one more monument to your piety. So, the warnings accumulated in stone inscriptions that nobody with decision-making power paid sufficient attention to. The infrastructure deteriorated predictably. Agricultural productivity declined. Population stress increased. And when the Thai army appeared, they found a civilization already weakened by self-inflicted environmental collapse. Human foresight existed in abundance. Angkor's engineers were sophisticated professionals who understood their systems intimately. But foresight divorced from political power is just documentation, the knowledge drowned in bureaucracy, in competing priorities, in the gap between what engineers knew and what rulers were willing to fund. The stone faces of Angkor's temples still smile serenely, carved by artisans paid for with resources that should have gone to maintaining the water systems that kept everyone alive, monuments to misplaced priorities, beautiful and damning in equal measure. Smoke drifts from Vesuvius, a mountain that hasn't always been a mountain, not in living memory anyway, but in old stories, in Greek accounts from centuries past. In the streets of Pompeii, market vendors sell fish brought from the Bay of Naples. Brothels operate openly, their walls decorated with explicit frescoes. Bakeries bake bread in stone ovens. The city is Roman prosperity made tangible, prosperous, cosmopolitan, entirely unprepared for what the mountain is about to do. Except, some people are prepared. They're just being ignored. The official narrative treats Pompeii as sudden disaster. The eruption buried the city in volcanic ash in 79 CE, preserving it like a ghastly time capsule. Victims frozen mid-flight, loaves of bread carbonized but intact. Everyday life interrupted by catastrophe no one saw coming. But people saw it coming. We know because they wrote about it. Pliny the Elder, the famous natural historian, died during the Pompeii eruption, trying to rescue friends. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, wrote letters describing the days leading up to the explosion. He mentions small earthquakes increasing in frequency. He describes the mountain's unusual activity. He notes that his uncle was aware something significant might be developing, but didn't grasp the scale. The letters make clear that educated Romans in the region noticed changes. They just couldn't predict the magnitude or exact timing. But there's evidence that some longer-term residents understood the danger more fundamentally. Pompeii had been damaged by a major earthquake in 62 CE, 17 years before the eruption. Many buildings were still under repair when Vesuvius exploded. Some wealthy families had relocated to more distant properties in the aftermath of the earthquake, never fully returning. Archaeological analysis of property records, preserved in sealed jars, shows a pattern of wealthy residents divesting from Pompeii properties in the years between 62 to 79 CI. Not a mass exodus, but a slow upper-class withdrawal from a city that no longer seemed quite as secure as it once had. The families that stayed, merchants, artisans, the less mobile population, either couldn't afford to leave or believed the danger had passed. When the eruption came, some had time to gather a few valuables and run. Others were caught entirely off guard, killed where they stood by pyroclastic flows moving faster than anyone could flee. Merchants closing shops not for the day but forever, gathering the portable goods that represented their life's work and leaving behind the infrastructure that couldn't be moved. Families ignoring small tremors because life goes on. Markets need tending, bread needs baking, and surely the mountain won't actually explode just because of a little shaking. The predictable disaster became unavoidable tragedy because the timescale of warning, years of minor seismic activity, didn't match the human timescale of action. 17 years is long enough for danger to become background noise, for the exceptional to normalize, for complacency to replace caution. Pompeii demonstrates a different kind of prediction failure, not the inability to foresee disaster, but the inability to maintain vigilance when disaster takes years to arrive. Desert sun scorches canals that stretch for hundreds of miles through the Sonoran Desert, an engineering achievement that rivals anything in the ancient world. The Hohokam civilization sustains thousands of people in what should be uninhabitable terrain through mastery of irrigation agriculture. Water diverted from the Salt and Gila rivers flows through precisely graded channels to fields that produce corn, beans, squash in a landscape that receives less than 8 inches of rain annually. The canals are everything. Without them, there is no Hohokam civilization. And the canals are dying, slowly, predictably, measurably. The official story describes abandonment around 1450 CE. People left. The civilization ended. No invasion, no apparent catastrophe. Just silence replacing what had been a thriving culture. But canal sediment analysis tells the story those silent channels can no longer speak. The Hohokam irrigation system worked brilliantly for over 1,000 years, but it had a fatal flaw encoded in its own success: salt accumulation. Every time water flowed through the canals, it left behind minute amounts of dissolved minerals. Over centuries, those minute amounts became measurable accumulation. The salt concentrated in the soil, gradually poisoning the very fields the irrigation was meant to feed. By 1400 CE, the accumulation had reached critical levels. Plant remains from late-period Hohokam sites show crops increasingly stressed, yields declining, agricultural diversity decreasing as only the most salt-tolerant species survived. The Hohokam weren't stupid. They could see the white crust forming on field edges, could taste the salinity increasing in their crops, could calculate that each generation faced more difficult growing conditions than the previous one. The evidence was literally visible on the ground, accumulating season by season, year by year. They tried solutions. Archaeological evidence shows canal systems being rerouted, new channels dug further upstream, desperate attempts to find water sources with lower mineral content. Some fields were abandoned, left fallow in hopes the salt might leach out over time. It didn't work, not at the scale and speed required. The chemistry was inexorable. In arid environments, irrigation inevitably concentrates salts because evaporation rates exceed precipitation. There's no way to flush the system naturally. Modern agriculture solves this with drainage systems, chemical treatments, and massive water volumes for leaching, none of which were available to the Hohokam. They knew what was happening. The declining yields told them. The white crusts told them. The increasingly restricted range of viable crops told them. They could project the trajectory, each year slightly worse than the last, agricultural productivity declining along a predictable curve until the system could no longer support the population. Farmers left tools behind in fields that would no longer grow food, not all at once, but family by family, season by season, as the calculations became undeniable. The irrigation system that had sustained them for a millennium had poisoned itself through the very mechanism that made it successful. The collapse was inscribed in infrastructure, visible, measurable, predictable to anyone who understood agricultural chemistry. The Hohokam had the observational data. They saw yields declining. They tried interventions. But the fundamental problem, salt accumulation from irrigation in an arid environment, had no solution available to Bronze Age engineering. Sometimes foreknowledge isn't enough. Sometimes the problem is visible, the trajectory calculable, and the solution simply beyond your technological capacity. You can predict the collapse, document it in declining harvests, watch it approach year by year, and still be unable to stop it because the chemistry doesn't care what you know. The Hohokam predicted their own collapse through agricultural accounting, but couldn't reverse the chemistry that had been decades in the making. The canals remain, empty channels through desert landscapes, monuments to engineering brilliance and environmental inevitability. We return to Angkor one more time because the final decades deserve their own examination. Temple walls stained by algae, water gates broken and unmaintained, the hydraulic heart of empire suffering terminal failure while religious construction continues unabated. Records show repeated warnings about water mismanagement accumulating like unpaid debts. Engineers and priests both sounding alarms, though in different languages, one speaking hydraulics, the other speaking divine displeasure, both trying to communicate the same message. The system is failing. By 1400 CE, the infrastructure had become a maintenance nightmare. The Bure reservoirs required constant dredging. The canals needed frequent repair. The water gates demanded skilled operators and regular upkeep. The complexity that had once been Angkor's strength had become its vulnerability. Too many interconnected systems, each depending on the others, each capable of cascading failure. Inscriptions from this period show something remarkable. Competing explanations for the same observable crisis. Engineers described it in technical terms: siltation rates, flow capacity, structural integrity. Priests described it in theological terms: divine anger, cosmic imbalance, karmic debt. But both groups agreed on the fundamental assessment: disaster was approaching. One inscription at Banteye Kadei, dated to 1410 CE, captures the tension. The engineer speaks of gates and channels. The priest speaks of offerings and merit. Both speak of water ceasing and hunger following. Perhaps they speak of the same thing in different words. That's extraordinary. A civilization in crisis achieving enough self-awareness to recognize that different epistemologies were describing the same impending collapse. Knowledge existed across multiple frameworks: scientific, religious, practical, theoretical. And still the infrastructure failed. Why? Because fixing it required not just knowledge, but coordinated action at civilization scale. It required prioritizing unglamorous maintenance over prestigious construction. It required decades of consistent investment in infrastructure that would never produce the cultural legacy that temple building did. The political economy of the Khmer Empire rewarded monumental construction, religious devotion, and military conquest, not the patient, invisible work of maintaining water systems. Temple construction continued even as the irrigation networks decayed. New shrines rose while old canals silted up. The disconnect between what the civilization knew it needed and what it actually allocated resources toward was stark and documented. Engineers requested funding for dredging. Kings approved funding for another tier on a temple pyramid. The warnings grew more urgent. The temples grew taller. The Thai invasion in 1431 CE found a civilization already in advanced collapse. The irrigation systems were failing. Agricultural productivity had dropped. Oil population was declining through emigration and reduced birth rates. The military defeat was just the final punctuation mark on a collapse that had been predicted, documented, and lamented for decades. The priests and engineers weren't ignored through incompetence, but through structural inevitability. The gap between knowing what needs to be done and having the political and economic systems capable of doing it, that gap is where civilizations disappear. The Khmer Empire had the knowledge, the technical expertise, the self-awareness to understand its predicament. What it lacked was the institutional capacity to override short-term political incentives in favor of long-term survival. Angkor's final phase demonstrates that prediction doesn't equal prevention. You can see the end coming, documented in stone, plead for intervention, and still watch helplessly as the system grinds toward collapse because the machinery of civilization has its own momentum that knowledge alone can't redirect. Human foresight drowned in bureaucracy, in systemic inertia, in the terrible gap between understanding disaster and possessing the collective will to prevent it. Terraced fields crack under drought sun, their geometric precision turned against them as the carefully managed water distribution system fails section by section. Rain that once arrived in predictable seasonal patterns now skips years or arrives as devastating floods that wash away topsoil rather than nourishing it. The Maya highlands, distinct from the better-known lowlands we discussed earlier, face their own collapse timeline. Cities like Kaminaljuyu show similar patterns: sophisticated agricultural terrace systems, urban complexity, then rapid decline. But the highland story differs in crucial ways that make it particularly revealing about the relationship between knowledge and survival. Glyphs fading under rain tell the story in their own way. Late-period inscriptions show increasing references to drought and divine anger. The long count calendar ticks toward what some priest astronomers calculate as a period of cosmic instability. They're not wrong. The climate calculations align with astronomical cycles in ways that ancient observers could track even without modern meteorology. Lake cores from the Guatemalan highlands show severe drought around 900 CE, coinciding with lowland collapse but playing out differently in the mountainous terrain. The highland cities had some advantages. Higher elevation meant more reliable rain. Steeper terrain meant better drainage, but they also had unique vulnerabilities that would prove decisive. The agricultural terraces that allowed dense population on steep slopes required constant maintenance. These weren't passive farming structures, but active engineering systems that needed regular repair, reconstruction, and adjustment. Every terrace wall had to be monitored for erosion. Every drainage channel had to be cleared of debris. Every irrigation conduit needed inspection and maintenance. When drought reduced available labor and disrupted social organization, terrace maintenance collapsed. Hungry populations couldn't spare workers for infrastructure upkeep. Political instability meant coordination between communities broke down. Resource competition diverted attention from the unglamorous work of maintaining stone walls and clearing channels. Without maintenance, the terraces eroded catastrophically during the next heavy rains. A single wet season could undo generations of agricultural engineering. Topsoil that had taken centuries to accumulate washed down mountainsides and mudslides. Terrace walls collapsed in cascades, each failure triggering the next downslope. The very steepness that had made drainage an advantage now became a catastrophic liability. Maya codices, the few that survive Spanish book burning, contain astronomical tables that track drought cycles with remarkable precision. They knew. The priest astronomers could predict, with reasonable accuracy, when the hard years would come. The knowledge existed not as vague prophecy, but as calculated projection based on centuries of careful observation. Some of the final inscriptions practically scream with frustration, not just at the gods, but at rulers who wouldn't act on the predictions. The priest astronomers were tracking environmental indicators, making projections, issuing warnings, and they were being ignored by political leaders who had shorter-term concerns, immediate crises, conflicting priorities. One partially damaged codex section, tentatively translated, appears to be an argument between a ruler and a priest astronomer. The stars show damaged, but the king says damaged, and so we continue. Damaged, knowing the harvest will fail. That's prediction meeting political paralysis in documented form. The knowledge existed, the forecast was accurate, the warning was issued, and the system couldn't respond adequately because political realities trumped environmental ones. The warfare intensifies in the final phase. City-states that had maintained trade and diplomatic relations for centuries turn on each other over declining resources. The hieroglyphic inscriptions document this too. Formerly flowery diplomatic language replaced by terse military announcements, celebration of conquered rivals, increasingly desperate appeals to deities for victory and rainfall. Resource wars don't leave much capacity for long-term infrastructure maintenance. Soldiers can't repair terrace walls while fighting over the diminishing harvests those terraces produce. Engineers can't plan water distribution systems while their cities are under siege. The knowledge of what needed to be done remained, but the social capacity to implement that knowledge evaporated. The civilization's own writings predicted doom through astronomical observation, agricultural accounting, and the bitter documentation of leaders ignoring expert counsel. The knowledge existed in multiple forms: scientific, religious, practical. The predictions proved accurate down to the generation. And none of it mattered because the social and political systems couldn't adapt fast enough to match environmental reality. The terraced fields remain, empty geometric patterns on mountainsides, testimony to agricultural genius and systemic failure in equal measure. Stone walls that once supported thriving farms now frame eroded slopes. The engineering knowledge that built them survives in the structures themselves. But the civilization that possessed that knowledge, that could predict its own collapse with astronomical precision, couldn't save itself from the very fate it foresaw. Colossal stone faces watch empty streets from towers that represent the height of Khmer architectural ambition. Angkor Thom, the great city built by Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century, sprawls across 5 square miles of urban sophistication. The faces are serene, perpetually smiling, radiating the confidence of divine kingship. But beneath that stone serenity, the city is dying its third and final death. We've visited Angkor twice already, but Angkor Thom deserves its own examination as our final case because it represents the endpoint of a pattern we've traced through 24 civilizations. This is where all the elements converge: environmental collapse predicted through engineering records, social upheaval forecasted through religious inscriptions, systemic failure documented by the very people experiencing it. Hydraulic records from Angkor Thom's final decades show a civilization in triage mode. Water distribution prioritized the city center over outlying districts. Certain neighborhoods lost access entirely, their residents relocating or simply dying as water sources failed. This was an accident. It was calculated abandonment of the periphery to preserve the core. Temple inscriptions grow increasingly frantic. Appeals to Shiva, to Buddha, to the Devaraja god kings, to intercede with cosmic forces. The inscriptions are specific in their pleas: send rain, restore the reservoirs, make the channels flow again. These aren't generic prayers, they're targeted requests addressing specific hydraulic failures. One inscription at the Bayon Temple is remarkable for its candor. The western Baray stands empty. The eastern channels silt. The engineers have fled. The priests remain to chant, but the gods do not answer with water. When the rains fail again, the city cannot endure. That was carved around 1420 CE, 11 years before the Thai invasion. The collapse was predicted, documented, carved in stone for posterity to read. Workers abandoning the city left letters and carvings that survive in scattered temples. Not dramatic departure statements, but the mundane details of people calculating that staying meant death. Lists of debts owed, names of relatives in other regions. Instructions for where to find them if anyone follows. The final warning comes not from priests or engineers, but from the silence itself. By 1425 CE, major construction at Angkor Thom had ceased entirely. The urban core depopulated steadily. When the Thai army arrived in 1431, they found a city already largely abandoned. Its hydraulic systems failed, its monumental architecture intact but empty. Its population scattered to regions where water still flowed. The Thai didn't destroy Angkor Thom. They just swept away what little remained of administrative presence. The city had already destroyed itself through the predictable, documented, repeatedly warned against failure to maintain the infrastructure that kept it alive. The stone faces still smile, because stone doesn't require water. But the people who carved them knew exactly what was coming, left detailed records of their predictions, and watched those predictions prove accurate while the system collapsed around them. 25 civilizations, 25 cases of foreknowledge, 25 demonstrations that seeing the end coming doesn't mean you can stop it. The pattern is complete. From the limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the serene stone faces of Angkor Thom, one truth emerges. Civilizations rarely collapse from ignorance. They collapse despite knowledge. Every society in this investigation saw its own decline coming. These weren't cultures stumbling blindly through history. Göbekli Tepe's priests track celestial cycles. The Mohenjo-Daro engineers mastered hydrology. The Akkadians recorded agricultural yields with bureaucratic precision. The Minoans understood the warning signs of seismic instability. The Olmecs calculated astronomical patterns with astonishing accuracy. They had data, prediction, and warning systems carved into stone, baked into clay, embedded in ritual texts. Collapse wasn't a surprise. It was the confirmation of forecasts their own specialists had been making for years. So, why couldn't they stop it? Because knowledge alone isn't enough. It must be paired with political will, economic structures able to coordinate large-scale action, and social flexibility to abandon failing strategies. When any part of that system falters, knowledge becomes record-keeping for a disaster that is no longer preventable. Across civilizations, the same themes recur. Environmental decline was measured directly. Soil salinization in Akkad and Hohokam lands, deforestation around Cahokia, falling water tables at Petra and Angkor, and drought cycles tracked scrupulously by Maya astronomer priests. These societies observed the trend lines and estimated the timeline to collapse. Infrastructure specialists documented failures in real time. Khmer engineers warned of failing reservoirs. Nabatean cistern keepers tracked diminishing capacity. Tiwanaku managers recorded shrinking lake levels. These were the ancient equivalent of engineering reports, specific, quantifiable, actionable. Yet social systems proved unable to adapt. Rulers diverted resources to monuments rather than maintenance. Religious institutions increased demand for offerings as conditions worsened. Elites maintained unsustainable lifestyles while peripheral populations fled. Political priorities favored short-term stability over long-term survival. As crises intensified, many cultures turned to ritual instead of reform. Olmec and Mochi sacrifices escalated. Maya inscriptions recorded desperate appeals to gods. When scientific prediction met political paralysis, societies substituted divine intervention for practical action. In some cases, the only successful strategy was withdrawal. Teotihuacan's residents departed an intact but failing city. Great Zimbabwe's population dispersed as resources dwindled. Angkor workers left written farewells. These were not panicked collapses, but calculated exits based on accurate internal accounting. What makes these collapses chilling isn't their inevitability. It's their precision. Their predictions align closely with modern archaeological evidence. Climate shifts, hydrological failure, soil decline, drought patterns. Their forecasts were right, and this brings us to the present. Our predictive power surpasses anything ancient societies could imagine. Satellites, climate models, global data networks. Yet we repeat the same pattern: short-term gains over long-term survival, political inertia over scientific warning, economic structures that reward extraction over preservation. Knowledge exists, prediction exists, but the systems required to act on that knowledge often fail. Still, history offers a thin thread of hope. While civilizations collapsed, people survived, those willing to adapt when institutions would not. The question now is whether we can transform prediction into action before our own warnings become artifacts.